As young children on the reservation, I remember the deep need to run. For all the young Indian people, both girls and boys, running was as great a characteristic of the indigenous life of the Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache people still living in their original beloved homelands of the arid highlands of New Mexico, as was their sense of comic joy, or the generous ceremonial house-to-house feasting throughout their villages, for which they are still famous. Like all of the English-speaking public schools in the United States that native and Spanish-speaking children of our area were forced to attend, there were always kids in the 6th grade old enough to drop out of high school, for it was they who were the first generation of minors in their family lines to be enforced by federal law to begin school attendance, no matter what their age. Characterized as arrogant, troublesome, and incapable of learning, they were actually not slow and certainly no more incorrigible than the rest of us. School for them was an imposed irrelevancy to the reality of their already adultish life they led inside their own natural native territory. They of course felt no compelling responsibility to attend an invader's academy that had so little to teach them in reference to what they already knew and would need to live regarding village planting, hunting, courting, and their constant obligatory communal ceremonial participation upon which old-time Pueblo life has always relied, and which was still a going concern in my youth. The casual special appearances and unauthorized disappearances to and from the classroom of these beautiful, rowdy older teenagers ran pretty much according to how they rated the entertainment value of the few chosen teachers whose method of instruction appealed to them. School authorities learned early on that these students could never be threatened with expulsion, for they would have loved nothing better. But there was one aspect of the school that no student ever missed, unless impeded by mandatory village ceremonial obligation, and that was a foot race of any distance scheduled by the coaches. To be truthful, they couldn't have given a flea's fart for the racing. They didn't come to race. What they loved was running across their own rolling wild homeland, just for the deliciousness of running enormous distances through the sacred itself. Like the feral multicolored horses, wild antelopes, jackrabbits, and swallows that coursed along with them, they too were made of elegant motion and just had to do it. In the same way breezes can't help but sweep the earth, they had to run. It was a delicious, ancient, inborn itch that paced in the hearts of their indigenous souls, that would only be calmed by running, and running well and beautifully. The school sports coaches, like most of the world anymore, were representatives of that neurotic, competitive need to dominate cultural trait that characterizes most large civilizations, and they always felt that they'd failed in life unless they could conquer someone else. They needed to win, needed to cause someone else to lose. That's all they understood. But in our school, they lived in a constant tangle of nervous frustration. The source of their consternation was rooted to the unshakable fact that even though most of these Indian boys over 13 had running times superior to those of adult Olympians worldwide, they could not be made to compete. They just wanted to run, and run at home over the wild, unpopulated land. Like a lot of teachers in other departments, these tall, non-Indian jocks became so infuriated about how they could never get the Pueblos or Navajos to compete in any tournament that before the inevitable tendering of their resignations, they usually transformed into bitter, listless, maniac whiners who labeled the Indians as unconfident, overly shy, or ashamed. Or as most of us heard over and over again, Indians are unmotivated race, lacking the go-getter gene, i.e. competitive ambition. The coaches couldn't believe the reality that all the young people, like their ancestors forever, just loved running, not racing. This didn't mean that they didn't run hard and fast, because they did. However, they didn't do so to beat a peer, but because hard and fast was part of the deliciousness. Though their short distance times were very good, where the natural peoples of this state of New Mexico excelled was in long distance running. The young men would run 10,000 meters or 10 miles or 4 miles, whatever distance was designated as a race, sometimes even stopping off somewhere to chat or check something out, always in a group, joking as they ran, and still come in well under international times. That is, if the coaches could have convinced them to cross an assigned finish line instead of just running off to smoke and gossip before they wandered in. The other problem for civilization's sports teachers and their need to win was the fact that though all the Indian boys ran good and hard, they never ran alone, only as a group. If they happened upon a relative or friend along the way, they always urged them to run along with them, no matter how much slower a pace they might have to assume to let their older friend keep up. For such was the grand etiquette of Pueblo Indian togetherness. This meant if one of their groups straggled, they would wait or run in circles, not to lose momentum until the slower fellow caught up. This was definitely not conducive to an Olympic record, but a normal score for the generosity of the indigenous soul. Even a couple of generations later, when so much of the cultural intactness of those times had been successfully undermined, and people were thoroughly indoctrinated with the syndrome of modernity's contradictory insistence on an unquestionable superiority, while suffering eternally from that hardwired shame of never being good enough, that fuels civilization's bullet train away from its own indigenous intactness. And after being successfully shamed into becoming as anxious as any Anglo about achievement, certain generations of young Indian men and women who'd been finally coerced into the nervous pride of home and away track meets, warm-ups, sweatsuits, shorts, numbers, running shoes, trophies, victory dinners at Burger King, and God help us all, recognizing a finish line, would even then stand jogging just before the finish line after running several miles ahead of everyone if one of their relatives was a participant in the same race and needed more time until he caught up, in order to cross the line together. Even after so much assimilation, it still felt awful to do otherwise. But the best long distance running I ever saw at that school happened when the heroes of my youth, a group of boys, famous runners all of them, about 16-year-olds, almost about 16 years old, several already married, but all of them still in the 6th grade, agreed to run in their first competitive long distance races. One of our more sneaky and desperately determined coaches secretly marked the finish line with chalk about 200 yards beyond where it would actually lie by official track standards, in order to get the kids running hard across the inevitable real line without lagging for the slower ones. But he was outwitted yet again. This had been a 10,000 meter race on the reservation against teams from many other places, when the 5 boys came leisurely striding in at least a mile and a half ahead of all the visiting runners, and while casually sharing their third disqualifying Camel cigarette as they sailed along, they not only technically won a world record that would still hold today if it had been accepted on the basis of time alone, but then, after unknowingly having crossed the secret finish line together, in order to avoid what they thought was the marked finish line, these copper-bodied human birds took a collective left and just kept running and coursing the remaining 5.5 miles back to their home village through the beautiful high-piled boulder desert hills and sandy areos in blossom with the wild parsley and four-petaled yellow mustards of spring to disappear utterly from the white man's world, their school and its program of achievements, running straight into the initiation kivas, where they began their antique lives, cloistered again as Pueblo Indians for the rest of their adult lives. 3 of them are there to this very day. Living and running were holy things you were supposed to get good at, not things to use to conquer, win, and get attention for. Running was not meant for taking, but for giving gifts to the holy in nature. Running was an offering, a feeding of life. This sometimes humorous but always devastating cultural collision between the need to conquer against the need to feed and give gifts was never more acutely visible to me than it was during ceremonial Pueblo Indian foot races. These are ritual cross-country races between people born for the powerful gods and goddesses of summer deities and people born for the winter deities. They were run by young men newly initiated, who of course ran in groups as the champions of the distinct gods they served. A lot of people always gathered to watch and pray for the well-being of the runners and themselves. In some less traditional, not so strict places, non-Indians, non-tribal friends were invited and fully welcome to watch. Though this welcome was never extended to any outsiders in my area, there was no ban on our visiting other more open villages. One time, while visiting with some friends who had a relative married into a less guarded Pueblo village up the river, a little outside the Pueblo, we gathered with all our female relatives, sisters and sweethearts, with supporters on each side to encourage them on. After the 15 of the moon side of summer got a strong takeoff, running against the 40 or so of the winter sun, the visiting tourists shouted and continued cheering in that adamant, well-practiced way, as they would at all their competitive events, as the painted boys disappeared into the wild. But this was Indian running, and therefore cross-country, with long distances, therefore most of it was out of sight. So as soon as the young runners hit the rings of grama and clumps of buffalo grass, the cholas and sabinas and boulders of the uncultivated area, and were out of earshot and into the dust-whipping spring wind, the villagers in the supporting crowd walked briskly back to their houses to get on with the traditional feast, leaving the still cheering tourists alone and baffled as to what had happened. Some of the good-hearted white people made their way with the rest of us to houses where feasts had been prepared, invited there by the parents and godparents of the runners. When the old people were asked by the outsiders what had happened to the runners, they were courteously informed that they were probably running, and would the visitors please sit down and eat with them. Such feasting was not only an honor for visitors, and one that was expected in the house of the family of the runners, an honor that comes with an obligation to accept whether or not one is hungry. It was a way for the non-running population of the village to magically give strength to the runners. This custom still lives on in every pueblo to this day. When further interrogated as to where the finish line was, the people usually said, whenever they stopped running, I guess, maybe eventually a more compassionate and patient younger person would tell the visitors the truth. There is no finish line. They're just running. But how do you know who wins? How do they know when to stop running? Why do they run at all? If someone actually broke the rules of tribal secrecy and told them that the sun and the moon and other beings that move in time and give us life are kept strong by the boys who run, and because the sun annually runs his own race and helps the animals to thrive by doing so, and that the sun tires, and when he tires, the world and all the animals begin to flag and die, and without the animals we would die, and the running of the boys helps the sun to keep moving and strong, and the visible world strong, and that the moon runs even harder but in a different pulse, and by doing so keeps all the waters flowing, the plants growing and maturing, without which we and everything else, especially the animals, die. And because for both the sun and the moon in the sky, there are no finish lines, they must keep moving, or the world dies. For if there were a finish line, the universe would cease. So the beauty and the strength of the boys running helped lift again these gods back into their eternal continuum, so the world wouldn't die. And though in some ways the boys did compete to outdo the other side in beauty, strength, and dedication, there was still no finish line, just an excellent running, as long as it took, until the gods had revived enough to do it themselves. So the world revived by the boys running would be the winner. Then the friendly explainer would be met by a menagerie of Anglo reactions ranging anywhere from indifference to contempt to a stirring admiration, by those who could feel the terrible heartache of the enormous distance their ancestors must have drifted from their own versions of a natural life long ago. Civilization's spiritual fear of being left behind insists that its constituents unquestionably race to survive, running only to ambitiously outstrip their neighbors instead of competing together to sustain nature. By feeding the beauty of human racing to the holy, the running of these young people was a grand thing, and they, just like all the weather and every natural phenomena, animal, plant, river, ocean, air, earth, every natural thing, who each run their own races to keep all their own diverse particles of the magnificence of a world made whole and alive. By doing so, the running boys would come in to the feast of life when it was time for them to come. And so it was. For when the race had subsided, each boy returned to his home, and together we all ate the food that we all knew his running had kept alive. Everything in nature ran according to its own nature. The running of grass was in its growing, the running of rivers their flowing. Granite bubbled up, cooled, compressed, and crumbled. Birds lived, flew, sang, and died. Everything did what it needed to do, each simultaneously running its own race, each by living according to its own nature, together, never leaving any other part of the universe behind. The world's holy things race constantly together, not to win anything over the next, but to keep the entire surging, diverse motion of the living world from grinding to a halt, which is why there is no end to that race, no finish line. That would be oblivion to all. For the indigenous souls of all people who can still remember how to be real cultures, life is a race to be elegantly run, not a race to be competitively won. It cannot be won. It is the gift of the world's diverse, beautiful motion that must be maintained, because human life has been given the gift of our elegant motion. Whether we limp, roll, crawl, stroll, or fly, it is an obligation to engender that elegance of motion in our daily lives in service of maintaining life by moving and living as beautifully as we can. All else has to me the familiar taste of that domineering warlike harshness that daily tries to cover its tracks in order to camouflage the deep ruts of some old, sick, grinding, ungainly need to flee away from the elegance of our original indigenous human souls. Our attempt to avariciously conquer or win a place where there are no problems, whether it be heaven or a new democracy, never mind if it is spiritually ugly and immorally won and taken from someone who is already there, has made a sanctifying world of people who, unconscious of it, have become our own ogreish problem to ourselves, our future, and the world. This is a problem that we cannot continue to attempt to competitively outrun by more and more effectively designed technological approaches to speed away from the past. For the specter of our own earth-wasting reality runs grinning competitively right alongside us. By developing even more effective and entertaining methods of escape, that only burn up the earth, the air, animals, plants, and the deeper substance of what it should mean to be a human. By competing to get ahead, we have created a breakless competition that has outrun our innate beauty and marked out a very definite and imminent finish line. Living in and on a sphere, we cannot really outrun ourselves anyway. Therefore, I say, the entire devastating and hideous state of the world and its constant wounding and wrecking of the wild, beautiful, natural, viable and small, only to keep alive an untenable cultural precedence, is truly a spiritual sickness. One that will not be cured by the efficient use of the same thinking that maintains the sickness, nor can this overly expensive, highly funded illness be symptomatically kept at bay any longer by yet more political, environmental, or social programs. We must, as individuals and communities, take the time necessary to learn how to indigenously remember what a sane, original existence for a viable people might look like. Though there are marvelous things and amazing people doing them, both seen and unseen, these do not resemble in any way the general trend of what is going on now. To begin remembering our indigenous belonging on the earth back to life, we must metabolize as individuals the grief of recognition of our lost directions, digest it into a valuable spiritual compost that allows us to learn to stay put without outrunning our strange past, and get small, unarmed, brave, and beautiful. By trying to feed the holy in nature, the fruit of beauty from the tree of memory of our indigenous souls, grown in the composted failures of our past need to conquer, watered by the tears of cultural grief, we might become ancestors worth descending from, and possibly grow a place of hope for a time beyond our own. Any of us born into the competitive, warlike, commercial conditions of modern life probably have our heads invaded by the distant gruntings of the sacred urging, of the scared urgings of civilization's hard-faced coach screaming, "You're nothing, you're nothing. You've got to win to be something. Outrun your nothingness. Run, win, be someone. Outrun the next guy. Outstrip the hungry depths of our cultural past." But deeper and wider inside the vast wilderness of the territory of our forgotten indigenous souls, a place not understood and regarded as nothing by the coach. Their course is along in its own special way, a valuable, beautiful runner whose rhythmic puffing and gorgeous, able motion keeps the sun and moon rolling, our hearts beating, the lizards grinning, the whales dredging the soggy sand of crilly oceans, the world jumping, living, dreaming, flying, whose dusty drumming friendship of feet on natural earth does not run to get ahead or away, but to come home again, to feast with the rest of our hearts and souls. And strangely enough, even the coach must eventually straggle in, for even he must eat. And of course, when it comes to the thinking of the indigenous soul and the generosity of seeds, there is always an empty chair waiting for even him at the feast table.